The last half century or so has been a good time for the study of the books of Enoch. Pride of place must go to J.T. Millick's publication of the fragments from Qumran in his 1976 book. Michael Stone led the way in drawing attention to the significance of the Enoch material for Second Temple Judaism. Paolo Sacchi highlighted its importance for apocalypticism. Michael Nibb did fundamental work on the Ethiopic text. George Nicholsburg wrote the most comprehensive commentary on First Enoch since the time of R.H. Charles. Jim Vanderkamp complemented Nicholsburg's commentary with his work on the astronomical book, and this work has been taken further by Jonathan Ben-Dov and Henrik Dravnel. The Enoch Seminar provided a forum where fundamental issues about this literature were discussed. There have been individual studies too numerous to list. So after half a century of unprecedented study of First Enoch, have we reached a plateau? Are there any open issues left to discuss? The question, of course, is facetious. There are always open issues in the humanities. In the case of First Enoch, the open issues do not arise so much from new methods, although some surely do, as from the limitations of our evidence for the old questions. Even with the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we still have only fragments of the original text. And so the question that bedevils all the pseudepigrapha remains: how far can we trust the translations from the Byzantine and medieval periods as witnesses to Second Temple Judaism? At least in the case of First Enoch, we have fragments from the Second Temple era in the original language. Consequently, no one can claim that the entire Enoch tradition was a late Christian fabrication. But this does not mean that the Ethiopic text as we have it is always reliable. The rediscovery of the pseudepigrapha in the 19th century was one of the great achievements of biblical and related scholarship. It brought to light a corpus of ostensibly Jewish literature that had been preserved in Jewish tradition and was evidently of great interest for the roots of Christianity, and indeed helped explain how Christianity could have developed as it did from its Jewish roots. It was the publication of First Enoch in the early 20th century that led to the recognition of a genre of apocalyptic literature that flourished in Judaism down to the early 2nd century of the Common Era, and in Christianity for centuries thereafter. The Dead Sea Scrolls did much to authenticate that rediscovery by showing indisputably that there was an abundant parabiblical literature in the Second Temple period, much of which bore at least a general resemblance to the pseudepigrapha. It is true, nonetheless, that the enthusiasm for discovering lost Jewish literature led scholars to gloss over the problems posed by the complicated history of transmission. In recent years, with the rise of new philology and attention to the materiality of evidence, there is much more awareness of these problems. In her recent monograph, The Apocalypse of the Birds, Elena Dugan states the problem as follows. The text of First Enoch is not attested in manuscripts before the 14th century of the Common Era. First Enoch contains a great deal of textual material that corresponds to that found in a set of Qumran fragments. Therefore, the Ethiopic is sometimes called the fullest or complete version of the work or works represented by our Qumran fragments. The pressing question becomes how and whether to correlate earlier fragments to later documents, or to fill in the blanks of the earlier with the later. One of the perils of treating our early documents as if they were de facto fragmentary remains of the work known as First Enoch is that it might falsely enable the importation of text and textual expectations from later traditions to earlier contexts in which these never existed. The problem, of course, is not peculiar to First Enoch or the pseudepigrapha. We have no manuscript evidence for the Hebrew Bible before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before the scrolls were discovered, we had no manuscript evidence in Hebrew before the Middle Ages. Most of our knowledge of classical antiquity depends on manuscripts from the Renaissance or later. Can we speak at all about periods for which we have no manuscript evidence? Dugan does not draw so extreme a conclusion. Her study focuses on the animal apocalypse, within which she distinguishes two separate works: the vision of the beast in 84:1 to 89:58, which is attested in the scrolls, and the apocalypse of the birds in 89:59 to 90:42, which is not so attested. She argues that the apocalypse of the birds is reflected in the Epistle of Barnabas and the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, both of which she dates to the 2nd century of the Common Era. She then proceeds to argue that the historical events in this section of the Apocalypse of Weeks most closely match the early years of the Jewish revolt against Rome, beginning in 66. It is not my purpose here to evaluate this proposal, but to comment on the methodological assumptions at work. We do not have any material evidence for the proposed apocalypse of the birds from the 1st century CE, any more than we do from the 2nd century BCE. Dugan posits a shorter gap between initial composition and first allusions than would be required by a Maccabean date, but the allusions are not beyond dispute and do not authenticate the whole Enochic text in any case. But her case for a 1st century dating rests ultimately on the plausibility of the correspondences she claims between the Enochic text and the first Jewish revolt, just as the plausibility of a Maccabean dating depends on the correspondences between the text and the Maccabean revolt. It should be noted that even some of the Aramaic fragments found at Qumran may be a century or more later than the presumed time of composition. Any reconstructions of the original setting is inevitably hypothetical and rests on the relative plausibility of proposed correspondences. This situation is not changed by new philology or a focus on material evidence. This is not to say that we shouldn't pay close attention to the material evidence, but the date of material attestation is not decisive for determining the date of composition. Dugan is certainly right that the non-attestation of a passage in the animal apocalypse in the scrolls opens up the possibility of a post-Maccabean dating, but the plausibility of any particular dating must still be taken on a case-by-case basis. The most controversial part of 1st Enoch in this regard is undoubtedly the similitudes, which is not attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls at all. Billig famously suggested that it was a late 3rd century Christian composition. Mickelsburg commented that this suggestion had been generally, if not universally, rejected, and added, with good reason. Billig's suggestion was based on the non-attestation of the work at Qumran, not on specific affinities with 3rd century Christianity. Scholars who work on the pseudepigrapha are generally trained in biblical studies and lack detailed knowledge of late antiquity in the Middle Ages. When they propose that a work like the similitudes be relegated to these later periods, they generally do not feel obliged to argue for the aptness of the later context. It is simply a referral to the unknown. The suggestion of a late date for the similitudes has been revived a few times in recent years. In some part, it is prompted again by new philology or by unease about the non-attestation of the work in antiquity. Millich argued that no quotation of the similitudes is recorded before the 4th century, and that claim has been repeated more recently, but it is also disputed. There is a notable parallel in the Gospel of Matthew, where the Son of Man is said to sit on a throne of glory. Literary influence seems probable. Other possible allusions have been detected in 4th Ezra, the second century Apocalypse of Peter, and Origen's Contra Celsum. The direction of influence may be disputed, and even if the allusions are accepted, they do not establish the antiquity of the whole composition, but it is far from clear that there are no allusions before the 4th century, and there are possible allusions already in the 1st century of the Common Era. Also, there is wide agreement that the original language of composition was Aramaic, and this too favors Jewish origin and an early date. In the case of the similitudes, as in the Apocalypse of the Birds, Non-attestation in the Dead Sea Scrolls opens up the possibility of later settings. But again, these later settings must themselves be subjected to scrutiny. The reason why most scholars have assumed that the similitudes is a Jewish composition is not only that it is preserved with works of demonstrably Jewish origin in Ethiopic manuscripts. Much of the work is concerned with the figure called that Son of Man, but he is never identified with Jesus Christ, and he is never said to come on earth, either as an incarnate human being or in his role as an eschatological judge. Not only that, but the epilogue in chapter 71 seems to identify him with Enoch. Scholars who claim that this is a Christian composition need to find some parallel to this depiction of the Son of Man in Christian tradition. Volker Siegert suggested that the similitudes were written by a monk who thought that Enoch, who had never died, would come again as the Son of Man. But what Christian monk ever entertained such an idea? Here again, the referral to a late date is cavalier. A date in the 6th century of the Common Era requires as much justification as one in the time of Christ. The late date of the Ethiopic manuscripts does not suffice. At issue in all of this is the diversity or homogeneity of Judaism in the Hellenistic or early Roman periods. The similitudes makes no reference to the Torah of Moses, but Moses barely figures in the rest of the Enochic tradition, even the fragments found at Qumran. It is often argued that the near omission of Moses is required by the pseudonymous attribution to Enoch, but this is gratuitous. Enoch gets to prophesy all manner of things that he could not possibly have known about before the flood. He could have highlighted the Torah if he so wished. I suspect that the unease with the compositions like the similitudes is not entirely due to the late date of the manuscripts in which they were preserved. It may also have something to do with the ghost of normative Judaism that still haunts our field and misgivings about the Jewish heritage of Christianity. I will conclude with some reflections on the question of genre in First Enoch. Genres are clusters of texts that are grouped together because of some significant commonalities, which are taken to indicate a particular kind of text. In some cases, these commonalities were evidently clear to the ancient writers, even if they did not have a name for the genre. I take it as clear that the similitudes of Enoch were modeled on the visions of Daniel, especially on Daniel 7, although the imitation of the prototype was quite selective. Affinities with parts of Daniel are also clear in the animal apocalypse and in the apocalypse of weeks. In those cases, it is less clear which text served as the model. The apocalypse of weeks is probably older than Daniel 9, which it resembles in its treatment of history. The animal apocalypse, with the possible exception of the apocalypse of the birds, is roughly contemporary. It resembles Daniel 7 in its use of animal imagery, but has more affinity with Daniel 9 and 11 in its view of history. The relationship is not necessarily one of direct literary dependence, but some affinity is clear. But other parts of First Enoch are harder to categorize. It is not apparent that the Book of the Watchers had a prototype on which it was modeled. It has different components, which are formally different and probably originated separately, even if they are held together in the text as we now have it. The story of the Watchers is a mythic narrative elaboration of Genesis 6. If the Book of the Watchers is read as an apocalypse, this presupposes that this narrative is subordinated as an introduction to the account of Enoch's ascent and subsequent revelations. The situation is similar to what we find in the book of Daniel, where the older core tales are incorporated as an introduction to the apocalyptic visions. In part, the problem here has to do with what Alistair Fowler called the life and death of literary forms. Genres are identified retrospectively. The author of the visions of Daniel surely thought of his work as prophecy and did not have the concept of an apocalypse. Later works that were modeled on Daniel such as the similitudes, or in part 4th Ezra, may not have had the concept of an apocalypse either, but they were clearly intended to be works like Daniel. If Daniel, or the visions of Daniel, is categorized as an apocalypse, this is largely because later writers imitated key features of the work. This is also true of the Book of the Watchers. The designation of the book as an apocalypse depends on its resemblance to later works that were to a degree modeled on it. In time, the heavenly journey would evolve into a well-defined form, with visionaries ascending through a defined number of heavens. This is not yet the case in the Book of the Watchers, even in chapters 13 to 36. I do not think that this disqualifies the Book of the Watchers as an apocalypse, but it is clearly a transitional work of hybrid genre. Recognition that this is an early, even experimental apocalypse does not preclude that it may have important affinities with other genres. In any case, there remains an open question as to whether the author of 1 Enoch 1 to 36 had a model or prototype in mind, or whether we can identify building blocks, so to speak, that went into the construction of this strange and fascinating text. Another area of open questions concerns the astronomical book. Recent work by Vanderkam, Grabnell, and Ben Dove has highlighted its affinities with Babylonian astronomy. It is now presented as a revelation, but it is only superficially an apocalypse. The content is exceptional in the Enochic corpus, but it is surely significant for the milieu in which all of this literature originated. Much remains to be done to understand the place of this remarkable text in the larger corpus of 1st Enoch. Thank you.